just a couple minutes so that everybody can get in. It always takes a couple minutes for the people to be let in. So we're just going to wait a minute. Hi, everyone. My name is Liz Hume, and I am the acting president and CEO of the Alliance for Peace Building. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a fantastic panel for you as part of our U.S. Peace Building series that started actually last April. We have had an event pretty much every Wednesday afternoon. We're going to take a couple of weeks hiatus during August since many people will be on vacation. We will come back in September for just a couple of sessions and with a roundup session on what we can, where we should be leveraging a lot of the solutions that we heard about throughout this series. We will then also be having events at PeaceCon, which is in early December, and many announcements will come out for that from the Alliance for Peace Building. So we will take these issues up again, and again, always be focusing on practical solutions. So the Alliance for Peace Building is a membership-based organization. If you're interested in joining us, we would love to have you. We are constantly, our network is growing. It is robust. We are 150 members strong, and we really focus on building the field, building the peace building field. We have, in the last few years, been working more on the United States, clearly as we see conflict dynamics and violence increasing. It seemed hypocritical to be talking about international issues when right in our own backyard, we were having significant issues here, conflict dynamics here. So this topic today was put together by my amazing colleague, Sarah, who works as in our learning and evidence team on religious issues. And he is working on our immigration issue within the U.S. Peace Building, U.S. Peace, Justice, Democracy Working Group. If you are interested in joining that group, please let us know. That is also a growing coalition of members that are working on the conflict dynamics here in the United States. So I'm just going to say something about the immigration issue. Immigration in the United States has always been a tough topic. You can go back into the 1920s, into the 1800s. We've always had immigration issues where groups are scapegoated. And this has really been a difficult time for immigrants or those that have immigrated that might not look like me in this country. There has been significant violence aimed at this community. A lot of immigration issues have been weaponized politically, especially within the last 5 years or so. And this is a topic that's really important because, going back a decade ago and even less, even conservative and liberal think tanks talk very much about immigration, how critical it is for our country, for the economy, and there are a lot of factual reports that talk about that. Unfortunately, as our country is changing in demographics, we're seeing, I think, a really critical issue that plays into our conflict dynamics. And if you look at some of the statistics coming out of the Southern Poverty Law Center or the ADL, it's quite clear that violence against, those that don't look like me are experiencing. So this is a really critical topic and really important for the conflict dynamics in the United States. And with that, I'm going to send it over to Saurav. And I just want to welcome our panelists. He'll introduce them and thank them all for their expertise and work on these issues.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Liz. As Liz said, my name is Saurav Upadhyay, and I'm the Research Manager for Learning and Evaluation at AFP. And yeah, I just want to say thanks to Liz and Jessica Baumgartner-Zuzek as well. I know that this is a new topic of conversation for us at the organization, so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to host this conversation on immigration with colleagues I really admire, so that we can learn more about how we as peace builders can be plugged in on this issue. So really thank you for the opportunity to moderate this conversation. And as an immigrant myself, this is especially very near and dear to my heart. So I mean, the United States really prides itself as being a nation of immigrants, and immigrants are a large part of this country, which is why, if we want to ensure a more just, secure, and peaceful US for all, we as peace builders have to work to ensure safety and peace for immigrants who are an especially marginalized and vulnerable group in our communities. However, persistent challenges with our immigration system is not only making life difficult for immigrants and the communities that welcome them, but also fueling anti-immigration rhetoric, as Liz mentioned, rising levels of white nationalism, xenophobia, and hate crimes. So in this panel, I was hoping that we could speak to experts about sort of issues immigrants face because of the US immigration system, how these issues impact like social cohesion, and how this is driving polarization and conflict, and what we as peace builders can do to change the narrative to address these divisions while ensuring immigrant communities in the US can live in this country in safety and peace. So to help me understand these issues, today we have Peniel Ibe, a policy engagement coordinator at the American Friends Service Committee. We also have Josh Leach, who is the policy communications strategist at Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. We have Oscar Hernandez Ortiz, who is an immigrant rights organizer and a co-founder of Undocumented Students for Education and Equity. And we are joined by Jordan Krumroy, who's the Southern Regional Manager at Welcoming Center. Welcoming America, I apologize. So before we start, I wanted to give you a quick rundown of the flow of the session. I have some questions lined up for our guests, and I hope to speak to them for about 50 minutes, sort of in a sort of panel format. Throughout the conversation, you are welcome to ask your questions using the Q&A function. And we hope to have about 30 minutes or so at the end to address some of the questions you've posed. So without further ado, let me just start with you, Peniel. One thing that you've said in the past, which has really struck with me, is that people often say that the US immigration system is broken, but you once reflected with me that our immigration system is not broken, but rather functions the way it was intended to function. Could you talk a little bit more about that and sort of reflect on the impact of this system on our immigrant communities?
Sure. Thanks, Saurav. Hi, everyone. Once again, Peniel Ibe with the American Friends Service Committee and doing work on immigration organizing and advocacy, I think now for about 4 years. So still very new to this space. And so I want to preface my comments today by saying a lot of what I've learned and what I understand of the system is due to my conversations and interactions with directly impacted individuals. And so immigrant themselves, immigrant communities, as an immigrant myself, my own experience, but more importantly, hearing from Black immigrant organizers and leaders who are often marginalized in these conversations, and thus can talk about the system and criticize the system, knowing that they've seen the worst of it and continue to see the worst of it. And so, like you said, Saurav, that statement of the immigration system is not broken, it's just functioning, is something that I've heard and something that I after learning and listening, continue to say myself. I feel like if one just took a little bit of a moment to look at the history, right, of what we call our immigration system today, either the legal precedents that move it along from the courts, things that have been put in place by Congress or things that have been put in place by presidential administration. So really the three arms of government, we'll see the impetus and the justification for certain things that have now framed our immigration system today do not have very promising roots. A lot of those roots, like many things in the United States, are racist, are anti-Black, are seek to continue to preserve the whiteness that that many of the colonizers at the beginning of the US's sort of history sought to keep going on. And so that in mind and that kind of goal really framed how we continued as the United States continued to create immigration policy, implement it, or fix it, quote unquote. In particular, I'm reminded of the comments that the Vice President Kamala Harris, as well as Secretary Mayorkas, about Haitian and Cuban asylum seekers saying they should not come. What I recently realized as I was doing some research was that the mass detention policy we know in the United States today has roots of our approach to initial Haitian asylum seekers fleeing the repressive regime of Duvalier back 70 years ago. When was that? I forget. But a system now that many suffer in, like the to Haitian asylum seekers, and so they have to come up with something, and then to justify not being racist and specifically targeting Black asylum seekers from Haiti, they were like, well, we'll just detain everybody, right? And so that's kind of like that is a theme across a lot of the policies that govern our the immigration system. Something you had said was that the U.S. prides itself as a country of immigrants. I would actually say the U.S. prides itself as a country that uses immigrants. We're not all a country of immigrants here, and it's very the number of immigrants that we allow in through what you would call legal processes versus the ones that we harm and hurt due to the processes and the systems that have been created, they are not equal. And who falls into what category and how they experience it. Even the quote unquote legal systems, the hoops and the loops, that's what people think is broken. And really it's supposed to deter. It's not meant to be easy. That is the goal. And so that is kind of how I see the immigration system today. The costs, right? Migration is a human right. People talk about asylum, they have to come in the right way. They have to seek. There's no right way to flee from danger. People are jumping out of buildings when it's on fire. And that's kind of the theme that as immigrant advocates, especially folks who are advocating on behalf of asylum seekers and refugees who are seeking resettlement here, that is something that we're trying to put out there, is that you welcome with dignity because people are fleeing conditions that they do not have a choice to. And so when Vice President Harris or President Biden or President Trump, whoever says do not come, it's less about where they're going and more about what they're fleeing. And our immigration system does not recognize that as much. It doesn't recognize that as much. And I think that's why we say that's the way it's functioning. It's trying to keep things streamlined. It's not trying to look at the individual cases. It's not trying to look at what people are fleeing. It's very US centric. So it's functioning the way it is. It's not broken. That's at least in my opinion and many that I've heard.
Thanks, Peniel. I wonder if anyone else had any reflections on that. Jordan, Josh, Oscar? No.
Something I'll just say really quickly, because I also share, that same way of thinking. And I think sometimes, I like to compare different systems in the US, and I think of the higher education system, or imprisonment system, which is how much money do you have, how much privilege do you have to avoid the really bad aspects of this, can you make this way easier for yourself? And I think as Americans, we kind of accept those things of higher education, hey, if you have more money, it will be so much easier for you to get into this one school or whatever. Same with people that go to two-person. So I feel like we have normalized capitalism in our lives that I think sometimes we just neglect it and we just accept it. So sometimes we see, well, if there's already a system and some people can access it more easily than others, then that's fine. That's how we do everything here in America. So, I think a lot of the times our culture itself that we have developed over centuries has generated these systems, it's developed this way. And I think it's going to change. I think a lot of more people just don't want to feel that way. I think American culture is just changing, and I think that's just part of being a country. It changes over time. So I guess we'll see how it turns out.
And Saurav, I think something Oscar just said that I really want to flag is the monetary aspect of the immigration system. Another reason why we say it's not broken is because it's making money for certain individuals. And the US is very like it's just who the country is. Like there's no reason to hide that identity of like being very monetarily focused, being very economics focused, being very capitalist in the way that it operates. And so if you're working on a system that makes you money, and that's your priority, if it hurts people and it harms people, that's the byproduct of that system because it's really accomplishing your goal. And so the amount of money that comes from incarcerating immigrants, the amount of money that comes from the systems of filing applications and all these other things within the immigration system, and it's not unique to the US alone, right? Something that we also want to flag. This issue and the systems of immigration and migration is not unique to the US alone, is definitely is when we look at the money, when we look at the amount of money that goes into it, then we begin to realize what moves it forward. And something that we've really realized is that it's no surprise to us that the imperial powers that created borders get to decide who moves through them and get to decide in favor of people that look like them more than people that don't look like them. And so that's just like, that's the reality of the situation as we see it.
Thanks, Peniel. I wonder, Josh, this one's for you. Of course, like one of the most visceral sort of manifestation of the challenges right now at the border is, or challenges with our immigration system is, of course, what's currently happening at the border. I wonder if you could sort of, talk a little bit about what's happening at the southern border and like how the system that we are in terms of immigration is sort of impacting what's going on there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Saurav. I think that's an excellent question and really relates very directly to what Peniel was sharing about the sort of racialized and discriminatory character of this system that's been built to exclude some and not other people who arrive. And I think when I think about the sort of media conversation that's unfolded over the last 7 months, really, since President Biden took office, what seems very clear to me is that we're living through a situation in which, anti-immigrant political forces in this country, and I want to be clear that when I say that, I'm really referring to both of the major political parties or elements of those political parties. We've been through way too many deportations and expulsions from the last 2 Democratic presidents to pretend this is just about one party or the other. But these political forces have really created a situation through heavily restrictive, draconian anti-immigrant policies that themselves generate a humanitarian crisis at the southern border, which can then be exploited in turn to feed an anti-immigrant narrative even further and to perpetuate this sort of sense that there's a crisis of some sort unfolding at the southern border, which justifies these policies in turn. What I mean specifically about that is the sort of years-long attempt to entirely shut down asylum processing at the border that we are living through. And this began under President Obama. We saw family detention increase there. We saw at the tail end of his administration an increasing use of metering, which is a sort of numerically capping the number of people who are allowed to seek asylum at a port of entry, which was originally, again, intended to respond to an uptick in the arrival of Haitian asylum seekers. So again, we're seeing this racialized anti-Blackness that Peniel was talking about. Under the Trump administration, of course, this was taken even further. We had the zero tolerance family separation policy intended to deter asylum seekers by making it so cruel that people would not even be willing to request protection in this country. We saw repeated asylum bans, some of which failed in the courts. We saw the Remain in Mexico program. And early on in the Trump administration, we had his policy advisor, Stephen Miller, explicitly articulate this idea of could we somehow use public health as a rationale to shut down the entry of asylum seekers. And so then what happens? March 2020, we do have a global pandemic, a real public health emergency. And it serves as the perfect pretext for something that administration planned to do all along. They dug in deep into public health law, found Title 42, which is a section of the US Code, used that for the first time ever to justify entirely closing the border to asylum seekers and summarily expelling people from the country if they cross the border. So this doesn't just mean, expelling people rapidly, which unfortunately was already the case under immigration policy. This means denying people even the preliminary screening that they're entitled to under US law for registering their protection needs or fear of persecution. And so this Title 42 policy is arguably, the most extreme of all the anti-asylum policies that have been put in place in the, checkered and contested history of that program. When we had a new administration enter office who, on the campaign trail had pledged that they were going to restore dignity and humanity to the asylum system. They told us they would restore asylum. I, perhaps naively, thought that Title 42 would be low-hanging fruit of this would be the first thing to go. Instead, we are now 7 months into this administration, and Title 42 is still in place, still being used to summarily expel people back across the border into Mexico, or if they're not seeking asylum from Central American countries, but are seeking asylum from African countries, the Caribbean, frequently being placed on crowded deportation flights and expelled, again, without any preliminary access to asylum. This is particularly affecting Haitian asylum seekers. And what do we do? What happens when we shut down the entire asylum system of our country for more than a year and a half now? Well, we necessarily generate a humanitarian crisis at the border of people stranded in incredibly unsafe conditions, who have been denied their rights under international law. And it becomes portrayed as a sort of inconceivability to ever resume asylum processing in the way that Congress intended, the way that the law is actually set up to function. And people, including some, quote unquote centrist members of President Biden's own party, say we can't possibly ever get rid of Title 42 in the near future because it would cause this flood of people who have been stranded there to suddenly seek asylum. And so the anti-asylum narrative has become a self-fulfilling prophecy in that way. And so that's kind of the main point I wanted to make. And then what are ways that people who what are ways that advocates can counter that narratives in both somewhat counterproductive, but ultimately productive ways? So I think the first thing to note is just that we need to be on guard as advocates against the possibility of unintentionally confirming the very narratives that we're trying to oppose in the way that we talk about this issue. And I'd say that perhaps the central anti-immigrant narrative in this country is that migration and people arriving at the border is somehow inherently bad in itself, inherently scary. And progressives, I think, broadly would not agree with that assessment, and yet they routinely confirm that narrative in the way that they talk about the issue. There's this whole language about trying to stem migration. We heard this from the administration currently in power. Now, certainly, forced migration is a problem. No one should ever have to leave their home against their will. And the administration's right to look at root causes of migration and what can be done to address that. But framing this as the end goal is to stem migration at its source accepts the fundamental idea that we're trying to combat in the first place. And it's really a misleading narrative about immigration. Another core right-wing narrative about immigrants is the sort of crime-immigration nexus. Now, this was very assiduously cultivated by Trump. He even created a bogus federal agency that collected, quote unquote, criminal incident reports involving immigrants. Now, a lot of folks in the advocacy space counter that narrative by saying, immigrants aren't criminals, or, there's pointing to low crime rates among immigrant communities, all of which is statistically true, but it sort of implicitly assumes, again, that somehow if there were heightened crime rates among immigrants, that therefore it's okay to stigmatize an individual based on a stereotype about a group, which is obviously contrary to the whole idea of due process. It overlooks the ways in which communities are criminalized in our society, and in which particularly Black immigrants are overplaced, racially profiled, more likely to have encounters with the criminal legal system. And so then when we say, oh, we're when we're accepting these definitions of what criminality is, we're already importing the concepts from this systemically racist policing and incarceration system that we have in this country. And then I think the last sort of narrative that advocates can unintentionally play into is when I think advocates, and I include myself in this, and the organization that I represent, we're certainly complicit in this, in making these mistakes as well. But playing into the sort of suffering immigrant or immigrant victimization narrative, which I think happens because people rightly wish to draw attention to the very real need for asylum and the violence and persecution that people face that forces people to become refugees in the first place. But it can, it can play into a false narrative of immigrant dependence, or it can trigger, well, it also kind of sets up the idea that people have to be perfect victims to be worthy of sympathy in the first place. And it can play into, it can trigger a scarcity mentality, particularly in white folks of privilege in this country, which the right loves to exploit. And of course, that scarcity mentality is totally contrary to the actual reality of how resources are allocated and consumed in the society. People with racial and economic privilege consume vastly more than people who are coming to the country with zero legal status, unable to access public services, who work and are exploited in low-wage jobs. So it's a totally false narrative, but we risk playing into it. And so the very last point, I'll wrap up here, but is just, if those are the narratives that we want to be sure that we are not unintentionally activating in our audience, what are some alternative narratives that we can emphasize in the way we talk about migration? And I definitely don't have all the answers here, and I've tried to learn from UUSC's grassroots partners and other people who are more directly affected by this and who can speak to this from their own experience, and welcome all of my colleagues' input on this as well. But some of the things I've learned to talk about from other folks working in this space is emphasizing the agency of immigrants themselves, countering this narrative of dependence, pointing to the agency and self-determination that it takes to become an immigrant or a refugee in the first place, emphasizing the contributions that immigrants make to the society, while also framing contribution in a broader sense, and not just not reducing people to economic or reproductive labor, which is also dehumanizing and has a lot of ableist and heteronormative assumptions built into it. Emphasizing the responsibility and culpability of the United States in the underlying forces that are causing people to leave. So one of the most extreme right-wing narratives we hear in this country, and one that directly came from President Trump and inspired the shooter in the El Paso massacre that we just passed the anniversary of that this week. One of those narratives is the idea of immigrants as invaders. And so what about the many US invasions of the countries that people are fleeing in the first place, whether it's Southeast Asian refugees in this country, it's people from Iraq and Syria, intervention in Central America and Haiti, and all these places that have contributed to those root causes. And finally, just to, I think it's important to emphasize human rights as the frame, rather than compassion, which I think we often default to. But compassion and mercy are virtues on behalf of the bestower, right? They position the issue as something that can be granted to immigrants and withheld, particularly withheld from what we might call imperfect victims, if we're referring back to that victimization narrative. Whereas human rights are important to emphasize because those are what people are owed. that is their entitlement and their right under the the international agreements that bind the United States as well as other societies. And so those are my thoughts about how we can try to affect that reframe and turn the narrative back on people who are trying to convince us that immigrants are a threat to our society.
Thank you so much, Josh. Oscar, Jordan, I wonder if you had any reflections about that, and Peniel as well. That's a follow-up questions for you about how do we combat this narrative, and to sort of de-weaponize immigration.
Yeah, I can take a stab at this. I think Josh is spot on, and there was a lot there too. I was actually writing down some notes, some great points that you brought up. I mean, we have been working on a campaign, really trying to pinpoint like where are those common ground places? What are the messages that seem to resonate better with folks? And we've really latched on to this concept of belonging, being that, we, to some extent, right, to various extent, folks have some sort of experience of not belonging, whether that was, one-time thing or kind of the story of your childhood or your adult life. There's some kind of rudimentary understanding of belonging, and our kind of work is saying, how do, we all know what it's like to not belong. And so let's kind of seize the agency we have to create communities where folks belong. And we found a lot of that's resonating with folks who maybe wouldn't consider themselves, immigration advocates or very liberal. They just maybe find themselves more perhaps in the middle, or really kind of struggling with, where they would land themselves. And so that has been something we launched a campaign with the Ad Council. You can actually view it if you go to belongingbeginswithus.org. You can watch some of the ads and read the stories of folks. And I think to Josh's point, like, we have to figure out what are the things that work? What are the asset-based messaging that speaks beyond our base? And I think in a lot of ways we're still figuring that out. But belonging seems to be one that we're finding a lot of folks echoing recently.
Thank you, Jordan. Oscar, I wonder if you could speak to your own advocacy, right? Like, I feel like you are an immigrants' right organizer who worked on advocacy around DACA, right, in a place like Arizona, which has a particularly fraught history around immigration. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the strategies that you and your fellow organizers used at that time to combat sort of anti-immigration narratives or rhetoric, and maybe try to build sort of bridges and with folks who may not agree with you 100% of the time. To change policies around it. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, hello, everybody. My name is Oscar Hernandez. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. I don't think I introduced myself last time. I mean, Arizona, I think is stereotypical, right? That, we're very anti-immigration. We're next to the Mexican border. For me, when I moved here in 2005, I was around 9, and, a lot of the world was just new to me. I was just excited to be here. The whole idea of us being here was just, hey, we're just trying to do something with our lives together and make money and be more stable. So my priority was just, well, okay, I'm a kid and I'm going to go to school, right? And do anything that I need to do. But being in Arizona, it was very quick. And even as a kid, like, that you have to kind of like be one step ahead of almost everybody else. And my parents, undocumented parents, also knew that. Back then, I mean, some of the things that as a kid, like, I already knew was, like, we had laws in place that were English only laws. So in schools that students can only learn English, right? Which in a very, very basic sense, like, it makes sense, you wanted to learn English, right? But at the same time, there's many scientific articles and research that shows like, hey, kids can benefit from learning multiple languages. Like, who would have thought of that? So, you know, we have those kind of laws. We have laws that say, like, if you're not a citizen, you cannot get financial aid for colleges, or even in-state tuition, which, again, if maybe you're thinking about it in a very basic sense, it makes sense. But unfortunately, as an immigrant, I am paying taxes all the time. And I can go out of my way to pay taxes, and most immigrants do that through an I-10, which is basically a social security for immigrants, social security number for immigrants to pay taxes. So I think, like, I'm just constantly reminded that, like, hey, I'm not wanted here, right? I mean, just as an immigrant, I'm not wanted here. We had a Sheriff Arpaio, who would do raids. I mean, he's supposed to represent the law, and I'm sure attorneys told him, like, hey, you cannot detain people just by if you think they're undocumented or not. And, you know, he said, I guess I'm above the law, and he decided to stop people. There's still a lawsuit happening. Taxpayers, you know, are paying millions of dollars to protect the sheriff, who, you know, then got pardoned by Trump. So there's a lot of history, a lot of context of reasons why I don't belong here, according to people. And it's a shame because, you know, I think, like, when you take a look, again, in a very simplistic way, why, like, this nation was created is people trying to live depart themselves from the British, you know, empire, basically. And this just doesn't make sense why people disagree with the idea of immigration. I think, like, everybody is, I think personally, my perspective of immigration is very limited, since I'm always referring to DACA individuals. And I think a lot of the times why we are so outspoken is because, like, we do have a way more American context and history that we learn in our education systems. We know that we belong here. We feel Americans. And as soon as we're told, like, hey, well, like, now that we care about politics in your age, like, we're going to tell you not. And then it gets, you know, conflicting. And one of the reasons when I was at Arizona State University and created a student organization to support undocumented students was because it is very hard to get into this position of college. It is hard for any U.S. citizen to go to college. And if you're undocumented, it's even worse. And I know what it is to, like, work as an undocumented person. I see it with my parents. I see the kind of, like, abuse that they have to tolerate, how scared they are about losing their job, about raising any concern. And with DACA recipients, we kind of see past that. We want to do better than that. I think one of the things that we learned was simply that we understood that we were ashamed of who we were. Like, I was raised with this notion in high school, like, oh, like, I gotta stay, like, quiet, like, nobody knows that I'm documented. I was ashamed, actually more scared, when my parents and I would be eating out outside and we would be speaking Spanish. Not that someone was gonna pull a gun on me, but I was scared of, like, someone just acting out and, like, dumping all this hatred towards me, because I'm a kid. I don't want to deal with that kind of stuff. And I think a lot of us were raised with that notion about ourselves. And I think our education and seeing all these injustices and trying to understand them was kind of what brought us together. And that idea of bringing together, coming together, was kind of what helped us out to stop hating ourselves, to continue to want to desire more, and to ultimately just show each other, like, hey, like, we do belong here. And there's a lot of history and a lot of things that our parents don't understand, that even Americans don't even understand, as to just the subject of immigration. You know, I think a lot of the times when I see things about critical race theory, right, or ethnic studies, that's something that's, you know, already even happened here in Arizona, where we have ethnic studies programs in Tucson that the state decided to persecute, essentially, and take down, and all this stuff. So we're not even new to that, you know. And I just feel like it's such a disservice for our students to not know about their own history, about how this country came about, what we stand for, what we believe. And it's just, and it's a shame, because I feel like we're doing that in a very political way. Like, we're trying to discourage people from just becoming educated. And I don't know. I feel like a lot of people that, you know, want to push against this idea of, like, we shouldn't allow any immigrants here. It's really hard, because we live in such a globalized world, you know, of economics and politics, that I think, like, we just have to, as a world, move forward in this idea of immigration, because there's no stopping it. As we've mentioned in this discussion, immigration has been a very complicated topic for decades and centuries, and it's time for us to kind of, like, change how we do everything in the world. What helped me was coming together, working with other people like me, creating spaces that allow me to at least kind of, like, hey, I'm not crazy for thinking that people hate me. You know, there are opportunities that I can follow. and just educating myself. And I think like once someone knows how to love themselves and they are educated, there's nothing that can stop them from doing what they want, you know? I mean, living in Arizona, I've heard everything about anti-immigration, and I think a lot of those arguments are not very reasonable. I think sometimes you can argue, okay, like there's a point there, but it's a policy point. Like policy, we know we can do policy. We have the leaders, we have the ideas, we have the solutions, but then when it comes to the politics, people get in the way, you know? I think even just take DACA, the perfect immigrant, right? The DACA people, everybody loves us, and yet we don't even have a permanent solution, you know? There's still Republicans trying to take it down. And it's been 10 years, it's been a whole decade. I mean, I'm supposed to be a kid still, right, with this DACA program, and I'm out here starting my career, I'm getting my degrees, and all I can say really is that for immigrants and underrepresented communities, they come together because that's how they can grow and develop. I think a lot of times people fear that because they know that that means change is coming. But a lot of the times, like, it's not even the underrepresented communities, it's the majority of the young people. They just see the world differently. And if maybe you think that the way that they want to do the world is wrong and maybe not best guided, well, unfortunately, that's the next generation. And that's just how America is going to be in the coming decades. So, but I'm glad that we're having these discussions because we get to hear a different perspective, or at least different approaches. I just believe that different people, even immigrants, just specifically immigrants, play different roles. Some people, I think most of us don't really believe in the US government, but that doesn't mean that we're going to try to, you know, make our way into it, be part of like organizations that can have a voice in Congress, and just making a difference in our own communities. One of the biggest things that we have is our story and our personalities. And I think people literally see the American dream in us. And that is why we are going to be what America is going to be. So we'll continue to do our part. I think a lot of allies and even US citizens are doing their part as well. I just know that we're such a divided country that it doesn't feel like this issue or any issue will be solved through a policy way, but instead it's going to be more through narration and discussions and understanding each other. So.
Thank you so much for that reflection, Oscar. And I think this is a good segue to talk about, Jordan, your work. I mean, you spoke a little bit about it earlier around sort of the narrative change, but also you know, in speaking to you, I really appreciated something that you said, which was like Welcoming America tries to build a strong communities where immigrants are sort of thriving members. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how is it that we can do that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. And also I see some chats coming in. I'll let folks know it's really hard to talk and look at the chat and the questions. So we will get to them. You're not being ignored. We're just trying to multitask here. So keep the questions coming. They're great. So I think I'll start with an analogy that, Saurav, when you and I were talking, I told you about this, and it's kind of really helped me change my framing around this. My background is as a social worker, and so I'm used to working with folks. And at the same time, I'm also an avid gardener. And my partner will tell you I spend way too much money on plants. So when I buy a plant, I want to make sure it doesn't just survive, but it really thrives in my yard. And so to give it its best chance, I'm going to first amend the soil. I'm going to add compost. I'm going to pull out these roots that might choke it. I want to make sure that the spot that it's going has the right conditions for it to thrive. And I could just plant things without doing all of that. And some of it might make it. But a bunch probably wouldn't. And so instead, I want to think intentionally through, like, what are the things, where should this go? What environment does it need? If the soil is barren, if the sunlight is inadequate, if, I've got one part of my yard that always floods, stuff isn't going to make it there. And yet so often, I think in communities, we really focus on the plant and not the soil. We focus on the individual and not their surrounding environment. And our goal is really to create these healthy communities, create these healthy environments where people can thrive. And so to do that, we have to also focus on the conditions that surround us. And so for this, we at Welcoming America, we partner with local governments and nonprofits to build communities that have infrastructure in place to equitably support residents. And so we do this by promoting intergroup theory, intergroup relations, to make sure that people have meaningful interactions with others that are outside of their typical social group, right? People that might not otherwise come into relationship with each other, and also by promoting equitable policies that support their full participation into civic life. I think the key here is that building that infrastructure has to be intentional, because like Pernell said, like these barriers that prevent an equitable society from happening, these have been intentionally corroding communities for centuries. And so when you change that and you instead focus on, okay, we need to build this intentional infrastructure, you in turn reduce the ability later for conflict entrepreneurs to come in, and they will, to come in with dangerous ideas, right? Because when they come in, you've already created that set of unbreakable beliefs, those behaviors, those norms that are showing how a multiracial, successful democracy is beneficial. And so I think that proactiveness is key. There will be folks that say, look at the chaos at the border. There's people, they're coming for your jobs, they're coming for your stuff. And to say, like, actually, we've got it. Like, look, immigrants in our communities are assets, they're neighbors, it's working well. That ability to say that is critical. And so I think our work to create welcoming communities where both longtime residents and newcomers can thrive because the conditions are intentionally set forth for success, that work is really the work of inoculating ourselves from the political gambling of tomorrow, right? To inoculate ourselves from that hateful rhetoric when it comes. And so, that to me is kind of the angle that we take. And I think if you're attending this webinar, you're probably also trying to figure out, how do we build this soil that's healthy, that nourishes the things that grow there, whether that person was born here or born somewhere else. And so our goal at Welcoming America is really to provide those promising examples. What are those policies? What are those programs that build that healthy soil from our network of folks that's doing that on the ground in their local communities?
Thank you so much, Jordan. I wonder if Josh, Pernell, you had any reflections on that. I think at the, so what is at the root of polarization is sort of this idea that, immigrants are a threat. How is it that we can sort of make sure that they are a more thriving part of our community? I wonder if you had any reflections around that. I think, Oscar, of course, speaking to you individually, like what are some of the things that were put in place that helped you thrive, for example? I would love to learn a little bit more about that as well.
Do you want us to go, or do you want Oscar to answer the?
No, Pernell, you can go ahead first.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
I think so. And just wanted to also flag for attendees that there's a conversation on how many attendees we have on. We're shuttling between 28 and 30 attendees, and it's also being streamed on YouTube. So you are in company. You are not alone if you're wondering if there's anybody else listening to us ramble here about the things that we care about. But there's something I wanted to flag, and as I'm looking at the conversation, I think it's important when we talk about rhetoric, narrative, polarization, and all of that, these things occur in a vacuum, and it's our goal to ensure that it does not occur in a vacuum, in the sense that if you do not know the systems that you're talking about and why they exist the way they do, you cannot get to the root of it, or you can't polish a fruit, right? You can't shine the apple if the tree is terrible. And so, one of our attendees is talking about the fact that we've had our borders open since inception to people of all races and creeds and more. And that's just not the truth, quite frankly, right? The nation's very first immigration laws in 1790 created a process to grant naturalized citizenship to immigrants who had lived in the United States for about 2 years. And it specifically only granted that to free white people, right? When the Chinese Exclusion Act, we have a bill that literally targets a specific group of people around immigration. And there's many more like that, right? So that's just not the reality. A lot of times when we talk about the anti-Blackness, is a lot of times the discrimination against some Asian Americans earlier on in the US was because it was just easier to categorize them as not white, right? And then they were treated in accordance. And at that time, if you were not white, you were Black. And what were Black people at that moment? They were enslaved and they were not given equal rights. They were seen as 3/5 of a person. And so another question is like, what kind of rights do we give somebody? When you say human rights, the human rights means it doesn't matter where you are, how you got there. You are awarded these particular rights that we have come as a collective, as a society to agree on. And I think what's important to note there is that society decides on things. None of this, you don't get born knowing your rights. You don't get born knowing how to navigate the system. For some cultures, religious books are the guiding text. For some, it's ethics, some kind of ethics that they've come across. Some it's cultural, cultural practices that have changed over time and have adapted to systems. And so what the point here is that the laws right now we don't have to live and die by them if they're not working for us, is essentially it. And what we're saying is that many people, in the US right now, it's about 11 million undocumented individuals. And we're just talking about the people in the US. Migration, when we talk about immigration, we're talking about people who could potentially come as well. 11 million undocumented people who are undocumented because there is no path to citizenship for them, right? Regardless of how they came in, what they're doing here, how long they've been here. If they say, I want to regularize my status, there is no path. 11 million undocumented people over the past decade and a half. So that means there's a system or there's a policy change that needs to occur to address that. But if that policy change occurs to address that, then who gets detained, right? So the money that's going to the private detention centers, the GEOs and the core civic, who essentially have stockholders who are investing in the warehousing of individuals because they came into the United States without a documentation. So when we get into the narrative dynamics of immigrants are welcome here and they're part of our society and whatnot, is that a lot of taxpayers and a lot of people do not understand that their morals are not being reflected in the policy. But we're also a country that has multiple morals. We're all from different places. We have different things that govern us. But there are economic benefits. If your morals are economics, there's economic benefits to making sure that people have stability in their community. And that means no threat of family separation. We saw family separation at the border and we were all in arms, rightfully so, but it took people seeing physically children in cages to talk about something. We've had family detention in the United States for decades. Right? At that same time, people were being separated. You've had people who've been torn from their communities when they went to pick their child up from school. That is family separation as well. So when your morals are not reflected in the policy, and then the policy is worded in such a way that you as an individual average Joe in the United States cannot even understand what's going on, then it gives people the power to polarize. It gives people who have political goals to use I want to say ignorance because it sometimes comes across as negative, but the fact that you're not even focused on this and you don't understand this enough to engage in it. So I'm just going to give it to you simple. Immigrants bad. They're taking jobs. They're invading. You don't know the behind the scenes. You're not if you're not a policy advocate, even members of Congress who come in are still learning about the immigration system because of how complex it is, right? And so I think that's something I want to start out with is that for everybody who's not sure and who's not understanding, it's not your fault. There are many things happening in the world, right? But the reality is that immigration policy is not a system that exists in a vacuum. It's lives of individuals. It's lives of individuals. And so every time we think about a new policy, every time we think about Title 42, every time we hear DACA, every time we hear Dreamers, every time we hear TPS, whatever it is, it's a person, right? It's not just a number, it's not a paper, it's not a document, it's a person's life. And you want people to treat, it's like, personally, I'm a person of faith, Christianity, you treat others as you would like to be treated. That's like the golden rule, quote unquote. And if I was ever in a place where somebody thought I wasn't meant to be for whatever reason, I would hope that the person will reevaluate and find a way to welcome me in. And that means if there's a policy that needs to be adapted to welcome that person in, instead of looking and leaning towards the enforcement and the othering, I will look towards how then do I move things around. If you have a guest in your house, but you have only one bed, you try to figure out, okay, so what can I do? You don't say, well, I'm sorry, there's just one bed, you have to go. This person is homeless. It's like, okay, I could put like a couch, we could share the bed. That kind of messaging, I think, is something that we need to lean into as individuals. Like, what are your morals? And if your morals are not the same as mine, it's obvious why you would lean another way. But the reality is, a lot of Americans, if they know how the immigration system functions, the horrors in detention centers, the impunity that our enforcement agencies, ICE and CBP, operate under towards immigrants, it will shake a lot of people off, as it did when we saw the family separation thing. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. That was just the tip of the iceberg. And there's so much more behind it. And just thinking about, as an advocate, thinking about how to like serve immigrants on a platter that looks polished and say good immigrant versus bad immigrant, I have to think about the fact that I'm also Black. And I came into the US as an immigrant, but I'm Black in the US. That is the identity that I have taken on because of the color of my skin. And then I learn about the history of Black people here and the conversations around the welfare queen, the person that's dependent on the government. And then I see the translation onto the public charge. And I cannot but see the connection between the narratives of the welfare queen and public charge today, about immigrants who are not criminals or are criminals. And then thinking about who is incarcerated, who is called a criminal, and who has been criminalized by the law. I see Black people again. And so then I'm like, I can't then use that kind of language and comfortably say, well, immigrants are not criminals. It's essentially, I'm saying, we're good, we're not that people. But who are those people? I'm part of those people. I'm a Black person as well. And so we call it the double jeopardy of living as a Black immigrant in the United States, for example, where you are over policed. A traffic tail light or whatever it is, like a busted tail light, a traffic ticket, can lead to deportation. And it has happened for many people because of the color of their skin. So when we think about like how it impacts people on a day-to-day basis, it's hard for me now, 4 years in this space, to think about it in a monetary value or how it's going to help the economy. This country is rich. Look at how much we're spending in the defense budget. Like, resources are not the issue. It's how do you want to spend it? Who do you want to invest in? Who do you want to welcome? And for me, I think that's like the crux of an immigration conversation. If not, we just start asking ourselves, so what is the law and what is it? But the law was made by man, like you and I, and we can change that if we decide that it no longer serves the morals and the goals that we want as a community.
Really well said, honestly. I think for me, since I think like two overarching things we were kind of talking right now or addressing is like this idea of fear, like people fear immigrants, and then like, what are the rights of immigrants? I feel like fear for me it's curious because if you're fearful of immigrants, or you're like always in a constant like, oh my God, everybody's against me, because I don't know my neighbors. Like the other day, the Phoenix Police Department were here and there was a helicopter, they were telling them to get out of the house. I was like, whoa, I don't even know what they're doing. Obviously something bad. That doesn't mean I immediately think every neighbor out here is doing something bad. So like, if we're gonna say like, I don't know an immigrant, I don't know what language they're saying. I mean, it's a stranger. Are you, I mean, it's reasonable to say that you're scared of strangers, but I don't think we all act in regular society being scared of everybody. I think like sometimes people like to use that when in reality they're just like, hey, I don't like people that just are not like me because I'm not used to them, right? But to say like, hey, let's just not have them here, let's just like abuse of them. That's where I personally say, all right, well, that's wrong. And like, I don't know. I mean, like fear, we use this idea of fear in different things, right? Like people say like, Arizonans say, I need to carry a gun because if there's something happening, I need to be ready to defend people. But then they don't even wear a mask. So it's just like, what are we fearful of, really? And as to the rights, I mean, like, we're just asking you to like the basic rights. Like, for example, when I think of immigrant rights, I really am thinking more of like reproductive rights, like, like workers' rights, like rights that just protect people for doing like the regular stuff. Like, I just don't want people to get exploited and abused because they're in a vulnerable position, And I think like that's generally what we will have rights for. So all I'm asking is for rights to be followed correctly. And then for like, I don't know, different executive teams to replace rights and like abuse them and like do this one like Title 42 this time. It's just a lot of playing with people's lives through this idea of like, oh, we have systems in place and laws. When in reality, you know, as we know, it's politics. We just play with people's lives to try to play this larger capitalistic game, you know. And when we talked about like how can we change this and how do we improve the soil, everybody's working on that. You know, we are making these nonprofits. We're getting these people in office. We're doing all of that. But like in Arizona, I've seen people that start nonprofits to send more undocumented people to college or make sure that, you know, undocumented people know how to start an LLC so they can work and blah, 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 blah. And at the same time, like, that's great, but we've been doing that even just with DACA for 10 years. And part of me is like, why am I participating in my own oppression? You know, and some of these people are getting paid for these nonprofits, you know? So it's like a weird, right, like gray area where you do have to do the job to get at least some results right now. But ultimately, you know that you're participating in this bigger game that you're not part of. So, you know, I'll just say fear. I think like if you're that fearful, maybe you should stay at home at all times. And then as for rights, just like, I don't know, what rights do you want? Just normal rights.
Yeah, I want to jump in. There's some questions or questions and comments. Somebody a while back had said, Stanton said, as a former teacher, is noticing that there's some resentment from kids maybe who were born in the United States and feel like they can't get ahead or can't have success while immigrants do. And I think that's one example of something we're hearing a lot. And I think that goes back to Josh's point about narrative. It is like, because an immigrant, you know, because we're advocating for an immigrant to have whatever right, fill in the blank, whatever thing you want to fill in the blank with, doesn't mean that that is being taken away from somebody else. Somebody else's success does not mean that you will fail, right? And I've been really inspired lately by folks who fought for the ADA. And specifically, I've been really inspired lately by Judy Heumann and her work on the ADA. And, you know, I don't, this was before my time, full disclaimer. But what I've come to learn is that one example, when they were saying, hey, you know, we need to have curb cuts, you know, the thing where the sidewalk, it kind of slants up to the sidewalk. And cities were saying, you know, no, like we can't afford to do that. Are you kidding me? You want us to dig up the cement on the sidewalk and make it gradual on every sidewalk in our community? Like, there's no way, we can't afford to do that. Well, they found the money and they did. And it's now called the curb cut effect, because what happened is it no longer became, you know, no longer was just a sidewalk ramp for folks in wheelchairs. It was something that, you know, bicyclists were using. It was something that parents who had kids in strollers were using. And so what began as this infrastructure change for a group of people, and mayors and city councils were saying, wait, you know, how many folks in America are just, you know, are disabled? Well, that's a very small percentage and we can't afford that. And, you know, that's a lot of money for a small percent. Well, you know, zoom out decades later, this is a part of normal society that just makes life easier and better for everyone. And I think when we talk about immigration, there's a lot, you know, I'm looking at some of the comments and there is sort of this fear, maybe a hesitation or a, you know, will somebody else coming here negatively have an impact? And I think it's important that when we talk about this, we're really talking about when life gets better for someone, it typically gets better for everyone. And so when we're, you know, one of the policies that we like to see local governments institute is language access, meaning that regardless of the language you speak, when you are going to City Hall, let's say, for example, and you want to pay a water bill, that regardless of the language you speak, you're able to pay that water bill. Or you want to request a marriage certificate, right? That when you're going, that there is a process in place to get you that service, regardless of what language you speak. Also part of the ADA, federal requirement. But that doesn't just apply to immigrants that might speak another language. That applies to folks that are hard of hearing, right? Somebody calls 911 and they're hard of hearing, or they speak language besides English. Regardless, the language access policy that 911 operations center has implemented makes it so that they can dispatch first responders. And so when we look at these things and we say, we have to make sure that people who speak whatever language can access the service, it's so much bigger than that. And I think sometimes in our field, myself included, we're guilty of expanding our minds to think of it as, this isn't us versus you. This isn't immigrant versus white, immigrant versus black, black versus white. This is how do we reimagine and create together a society where we can all belong? And there are specific policies and specific programs that we can implement that can get us a little bit closer to that. And it doesn't always have to be at the expense of someone. And I think that's hard for us to as humans, right? We naturally are worried about repercussions of things, as we should be. But what we're finding with most of these policies that we're pushing for, most of these programs, and we're seeing it time and time again at the local level of these sorts of things, when you make life better, when you remove a barrier for someone, you make life easier for other people beyond that specific someone. I think that's important to remember as well.
So if I just chime in a second, I think something that I wanted to also just flag is, in a lot of times, and I think Josh talked about it a little, we try to justify our policy actions by the extremes. Folks extremely in need of life-changing, life-saving solutions, or folks that are really good and there's no reason why you shouldn't support them. And I just want to find the person in the middle, the average Joe, the person who's just living life, person who's not fleeing a regime or fleeing war or violence, but is looking for a better opportunity for their family, an economic migrant, you might say, for some. Or moving to reconnect with family for some, and I think that the more your morals, my morals, and that part of designing for the margin that finds a way to cover that person as well, I think is something that we need to be leaning into. A lot of people, studies show that people who leave due to economic reasons don't leave because their markets are not connected to the international trade and development of the world, but rather because their markets are connected, it has developed or it has advanced in a way that no longer serves their needs. And so they have to move. And the reality, and then we have climate change, which I know we haven't spoken about here, where we're all going to see what it feels like to have to flee something that you have absolutely no idea how to control. We saw the terrible conditions, the heat in parts of the world, the floodings in countries that, Europe, Germany, the deaths in Germany, things like that. And people just only started to understand a little bit what it feels to be when your hands are tied in a situation and you don't know what to do, but you need help. And it's just, you don't have the ability to do it the right way or to follow certain processes. And so we'll get into that. As life goes on, the reality is that our world is going to advance in a way where people are going to be moving for multiple more reasons that don't require you to see them bleeding and begging for mercy to offer them solutions, but just the reality is that they have to move because this is what's better. And do we not want to be a people that acknowledge the fact that growth and move and sort of advancing oneself or wanting to be with family or a community that you feel welcomed in is a viable reason to go somewhere? We're talking about borders, and I will always say it again. We talk about borders, sovereign borders, and the laws and all these things. They're all man-made decades ago. And we are they're human-made, sorry, to be more inclusive in my language, they're more human-made decades ago. And we can decide how that pans out, depending on where we are. We were not talking about climate change or global warming when Nigeria was colonized by the British and suctioned off Cameroon or Ghana or whatever neighboring countries. And so if it means because of new equations introduced into or new variables introduced into the equation, we have to revisit certain things. other than the fear and that polarization, again, that we come into, that makes you feel like you cannot adjust and you're not flexible and you're not adaptable to systems and societies and new ways of living and thinking and inviting more people into your space, that I wonder what other reason there is for one to not be. And I think it's more than just be pro-immigrant, but to welcome people with dignity, whatever dignity means to you.
Thanks, Peniel. And this question is for all of you. I wonder if you knew of anyone doing good messaging around this. Like if you could point to any person or any organization, any entity, just sort of doing good messaging around countering this narrative and reducing this fear or polarization. I would love some examples. Yeah.
I know that I was a advocacy corps organizer with the Friends Committee for National Legislation. They focus on different issues, but one of them is immigration. And I think their biggest approach is literally just educating their own faith-based organization members, but as well as just the general population. That's why they like to have discussions like these. That's why they like to bring not only young people, because they also have programs that are for older individuals, but just the idea of like, hey, we just want people to be engaged. We just want people to be talking about this. We just want people to be more informed. So I think that's a good organization to check out. Maybe you have someone that you think, hey, like, or even yourself, if you want to be more involved, that's a way to do it.
Yeah, I can name a few for folks that are wanting to learn more about kind of the narrative side of things. I mean, we have quite a few. If you go to welcomingamerica.org and you click on, I think it's Learn at the top, and then resources, you can, there's webinars and toolkits, and a lot of that is publicly available. Some other great nonprofits that are doing kind of this narrative work, Narrative 4, which is out of New York, they're doing great work with students, thinking about, you know, teachers are often the frontline workers when it comes to having a mix of folks in the classroom that maybe don't know each other, and what are they to do and how do they navigate that. So Narrative 4 is doing great work. Essential Partners is also doing great work on communication across difference, and kind of they do customized trainings. Story Stitch is a really neat organization, a little bit different, out of Minneapolis, that they have a card game that is useful if you are working in a group and you want to maybe start getting discussion going. They've got a card game that each card has a question on it. And so you kind of pass them out, and you can ask these questions of each other. They also produce books where immigrant youth tell their stories. It's really, really powerful. Yeah, I can post these, Liz. I'll put them in the chat. So those are some that come to mind. What we're finding is that the best narrative is actually one in which people are talking to each other while working on a common goal. And so we're seeing really promising examples coming out of things like, you know, a group gets together to pick up trash in their neighborhood, or to volunteer at a soup kitchen, or to build a Habitat for Humanity house. And so it's no longer about like, let's sit down and talk about why you're a Republican and I'm a Democrat. It's really about like, hey, we both have this common value, right? We both want our neighborhood to not have trash on the street. We both want this family to have a house. We both want people to not die of starvation in our community. We have this common goal, and let's actually come together to work toward it. And what we find is that there's a theory, contact theory, that was developed in the 1950s by Gordon Allport. He really set forth like, what are the conditions for people to change their minds about each other? And found that talking is good, and there's definitely promising research. I just named some awesome organizations doing great dialogue work. And also, one of the ways to change the narrative is to change who is connecting with each other and the conditions in which they're connecting. And so there's some really neat organizations in our network I'm happy to connect folks with later, provide examples that are bringing people together, not just to get together and talk about what's different or what's in common, but to actually work on projects of shared concern. So I'll put some of this in the chat as well for folks.
Thank you, Jordan. Josh, I wanted to involve you as well, because Yeah, you've been a little not part of the conversation. So there's a question for you in the Q&A, and I wonder if you could address that. So basically, Nicole asks, to further follow up on Josh's discussion, what are your ideas on alternating the narrative that has been cemented today regarding fears of the pandemic and immigrants who are trying to enter the US? You discussed Title 42, and I'm interested in other implications that have encouraged this narrative.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to address that. And first of all, just want to say, I've been quiet because I love hearing from my co-panelists, and you all just brought so many really key insights around how we can, in day-to-day practice, counter these sort of narratives of scarcity and zero-sum thinking. Really appreciated what you said about that, Jordan, and Peniel and Oscar, around sort of taking us from these high-level policy conversations to remember that every single policy we're talking about, as you both said, impacts human lives and people's futures, and remember that that's really the core of what we're talking about. I found that a very salient reminder for myself as well. And so I think Title 42 is a good example of something that has a legalistic name, and because of the complexities around the policy, I feel that it's never really penetrated the public conversation in a real way. Certainly not as much as the family separation policy, for instance. And yet, day to day, it has life-threatening impacts on people. If people are being expelled without any due process whatsoever, it puts them at immediate risk of being kidnapped and extorted from organized crime in Mexico, of being persecuted in their home countries from the exact threats they originally escaped from. And so it's really an important issue to focus on the human impact of it. And I'd say that, to the question about the connection, I think you're raising an excellent point, Nicole, that the policy has been justified by drawing this connection to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's important to remember sort of how deliberate it was on the part of the Trump administration to try to exploit a real public health crisis by falsely tying it to asylum. And from the moment that Title 42 was proposed, experts inside the CDC actually opposed and resisted the policy. There's been considerable reporting on internal discussions around this, and it kind of had to be imposed against the objections of public health experts in the administration. And it continues to be contested by people who assert that there's no scientific evidence to suggest that this policy in any way helps to control a pandemic. There are all kinds of public health protocols that can be used to process asylum seekers safely. It's a sort of false trade-off between our international legal obligations and what it takes to protect public health. And I'd say that, recently we're seeing, particularly from sort of far-right politicians at the state level, this narrative of immigrants are responsible for the Delta variant of the virus and the out-of-control surges we're seeing around the country in that. And I think this is yet another one of these situations that we talked about earlier of the anti-immigrant narrative becoming sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy or a vicious circle, where you have the same governors like Greg Abbott in Texas or Ron DeSantis in Florida who have imposed, they have imposed executive orders saying that schools and public facilities cannot require masks, cannot require vaccinations. These are governors who have done the most in their own states to ensure the spread of COVID-19, to promote anti-masking, anti-public health disinformation, allowing the Delta variant to spread out of control. And then they turn around and say, but it's immigrants' fault, and there's a total hypocrisy and incompatibility between these two right-wing narratives around COVID, right? It's COVID-19 in one context is, it's a made-up excuse to take your freedoms and force you to wear a mask. In another context, COVID-19 is a plague caused by Asian immigrants and Central American immigrants and Black immigrants. And those narratives make no sense together whatsoever, except that they both feed this underlying need to stigmatize and other a group of people. And so I think just to regard the COVID immigration nexus as just another one of these many examples of attempts to seed disinformation around this very real public health crisis we're going through, and that it's unscientific and incorrect. And in this domain, as in every other, we really need, what it takes to keep people safe is the same, no matter where you come from or what, artificial, as Peniel was saying, historically constructed border you've crossed. It's vaccination, social distancing, masking up. And, one other thing to add about that is just, again, the hypocrisy of the United States, which has in many ways hoarded knowledge about vaccination and how to create the vaccines, and hoarded supply, which in turn leads to the pandemic, which is still out of control in many parts of the world and causing severe economic consequences, and then fueling the Delta variant even within our own country by widespread vaccine hesitancy and the embrace of this disinformation conspiracy theories about the vaccine. So yeah, that's my take on that.
Great. Thanks, Josh. There's another question on here, and this one's for Oscar. Oscar, Nicole asks another follow-up from Oscar's discussion. I was interested on what you mean by a narrative. What does this mean, and what do you think consists of a shift in narratives? Is this through pedagogical, epistemological, ontological, or other ways of thinking?
Okay, yeah, not sure about the last couple of words there, but I mean, narrative is just sharing your story, telling people like your story, who you are. Why should we care about you? Why should we feel different about you, right? Like this idea of like, please guys, accept me. But the idea is that like a lot of the times, at the most basic level, people think, well, why don't you just follow the rules, right? Once you explain to people how the rules work, the only way that I can become a citizen, even though I have DACA, even though I've proven myself to be worthy of that program, is to marry a US citizen, right? I don't necessarily want to do that. But the point is, once people understand that the rules don't work and you explain to them, now they're going to start asking possibly better questions, and a lot of the times people also don't really like to talk about politics, right? But they are influenced by the stories of people because, well, I think it's a more peaceful way to go about it. And when you share with people what your family has done, the struggles that they face every day, a lot of the times the incidents that they've already encountered that in a way they've been kind of like been screwed over basically because of their disadvantage in this country, and I think a lot of the time people start connecting dots like, hey, yeah, like people shouldn't really be treated like this. I just, if they want to work for minimum wage, when in reality should be get paid more money just because their immigrants can get lower. So I think a lot of people just start kind of like understanding your story. They start to understanding the idea of who's an immigrant now compared to, I don't know, like 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think they just have a better questions and just to grasp this idea, and I think that's what I mean by narrative. A lot of the times for people that are trying to push a narrative, if you will, it's just, I don't know, starting an organization, being outspoken. If there's a law that's going to really put people in danger, going up to either the legislature or some community park and just bringing people together, like being outspoken on social media. And outspoken doesn't mean just shouting stuff and like saying like, I hate the right or I hate white people, because it's not like that. I mean, if you want to look at it like that, then obviously the message is never really going to get to you. But it's just the idea of like, let's talk about this because it's important. And that's what I see kind of like the idea of like just having narratives with people. And for example, like here's a narration, here's a story that I've experienced. When my dad was a taxi driver as an undocumented person here in this country, in Arizona, there was raids happening in neighborhoods, specifically neighborhoods that we knew there was a lot of Latinos in there. So we're just kind of, they were expecting they were going to find undocumented people there. So my dad was driving through there. He sees the raid happening ahead. You know, they blocked the road. He's panicking. He obviously thinks to himself, if I turn around, that's going to be suspicious. And then he was telling me, this is like at the dinner table after I got from school that day. He's telling me, well, there was a guy who started waving at me, and I go into, it was like apartments right before the blockage. And he went in there. I guess he was another immigrant, and he let him in to kind of just wait till they went away. So I think for me that was, you know, a huge lesson as a kid, because you're right. You know, some people say, I don't want to open my door to immigrants or people, strangers. And I get it, but we got our own. We're good. We don't really need you, you know? So it's just pushing this narrative, is just talking about our experience, showing people that, hey, thank you for sharing what you told me. This is why I think it's not that good of an idea, or even that original. So when people maybe start seeing that, maybe they dislike those ideas. Maybe they don't like me hearing say that their country is going to change, but I don't really care about them. They never really cared about me. I mean, if someone tells me, do you have a prejudice against the right? I have a prejudice against everybody here, like the right, the left. I don't think anything happens in this country that's good for its own citizens or anybody else. So yes, I have a lot of ideas and strong opinions, but I think if you talk to me, I can explain to you very easily why that's the case. And I think a lot of the times people will like hear me out. So, so narratives are important to me because I like just having discussions with people.
So Rob, there's a question from Nicole that that I think we should address, especially because there was a comment Oscar just made about decisions in this country not even working for its citizens as well. And we can go on and on and on about those things. But that, you know, what are some ways in which Indigenous natives are also impacted by immigration? I think that question is very interesting because we get into a space where we think it's either or. And like the US government, the structure right now, owes so much to indigenous communities that are within the bounds of the physical borders of the US, but also indigenous communities across Northern America that were displaced to create what we know as the US today, that are independent of its legal obligations towards immigrants, migrants that they have signed onto law, either refugee convention, international law, whatever, or its moral obligations, its ethical obligations, and they can address both. I personally do not interact much with Indigenous community members, and so will not you know, say that I know how they feel about the immigration policies today, or the arrival of immigrants or the departure of immigrants, whatever that is. But what I do know is that what is owed Indigenous communities is its own bucket of work that needs to be addressed, independent of immigration, because if you try to put either or, then it pits two communities that are just, I don't want to say victims, but are really functioning within a system of imperialism and colonization in a lot of spaces, who do not like, how do I say it? Like, who do not need to look at each other as the enemy in this situation, right? Because we know that there's enough to go around. And I feel like defeating that scarcity mentality to say there is enough to address every issue. We just need to put our minds to saying we will do this and this and this and this, and not either or.
Yeah, thank you for that answer, Peniel. And I just want to, you know, we just have a minute. Just want to say thank you so much for this, and just want to read a good comment for you all. So it's Fikre says, great discussion. I think we probably have to make a distinction between immigration and refugees who flee for their lives. Humanitarian immigration, for me, humanitarian immigration has ended at the 1979 Indo-Chinese Rescue Resettlement Operation, in which the US and the global North resettled refugees. Since then, the narrative has changed. Our moral values of compassion and humanitarianism are eroded. When you have poor countries like Uganda who open their doors to 2 million refugees, and then when you have rich countries who close their borders, portraying refugees as invaders, that to me signals we have lost our moral values. Sadly, this is happening 70 years after the world agreed to protect refugees and defend human rights. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and say, yeah, Fikre was showing appreciation to you all. Really quick comment as well. I think this is also a really good feedback from Jamil, who says, an Indian sociologist, Ashutosh Varshney, wrote a book called Ethnic Conflict and Civic Life. He was curious why some cities in India had a lot of ethnic strife and others didn't. He decided to look at the cities with low levels of ethnic strife. He found that these cities made it easy to get together over mundane activities, memberships in PTAs, choirs, services, orgs like Rotary, Lions Clubs, etc. So just wanted to flag another way that we can sort of build better communities in which immigrants are sort of thriving members, I would say. So having said that, I just want to say thank you so much for this amazing conversation. I really appreciate you joining. And yeah, I'm going to stick around. I'm just going to say, share a few resources that you all shared with me once again with everyone in the chat. But yeah, just deep appreciation for coming and joining us. And thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Yeah.
Thanks so much for having us. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.